My brother left his tablet unlocked on my counter, and what I found in that family group chat turned years of quiet sacrifice into a weapon I spent 11 months sharpening for one unforgettable revenge dinner. I stood in my brother's kitchen with a bag of groceries he'd begged me to bring on my way over, chicken thighs and a bag of rice he swore he'd pay me back for, and his tablet lit up on the counter before I even set the bag down. It was a Tuesday evening in September, the kind of ordinary night that never announces itself as the night everything changes. The screen was already unlocked. A message notification sat right on top, bold and impossible to miss. The chat was named Just Us. I scanned the member list out of habit, the way you'd check a receipt. My name wasn't on it. I should have set the tablet face down and walked into the living room. I didn't. The first message on the screen was from my mother, Diane. "She'll keep paying as long as we act grateful enough," Weston had replied with a laughing emoji. "She needs to feel needed. That's the trick." My sister Harlow had added, "Don't push this month. She already covered the electric and my car note." My thumb moved before I told it to. I scrolled up. 11 months of messages unspooled under my thumb. Screenshots of my own Venmo transfers. My name circled in red like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was standing for. A whole thread dissecting how hard I was getting to guilt lately, and what tone worked best to soften me back up. Someone, I think it was Harlow, had typed, "She's getting suspicious. We need to dial it back for like 2 weeks." Weston had answered, "She always comes back around by Sunday dinner." There was a voice memo. I almost didn't play it. I played it. It was Weston, doing an impression of me at Christmas, his voice pitched high and breathless. "Of course, whatever you need, you're my family." 3 laughing face reactions. My mother had typed underneath it, "She really said that to my face." I set the tablet down exactly where I'd found it, screen still glowing, angle untouched. Weston walked back into the kitchen a second later, holding 2 beers, and I smiled at him the way I'd smiled at him 1,000 times before. I said nothing. I took the beer he handed me. I asked him how work was going, and he told me about a coworker he didn't like, and I nodded in all the right places, and the entire time some other part of me was already taking inventory. That night, in my own apartment, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and made 2 lists. The first was every bill that had my name attached to something that wasn't only mine. The second was every account I was quietly funding for people who called me their family and meant something closer to their sponsor. At 11:40 that night, I called a lawyer a coworker had recommended once, half joking after I'd complained about co-signing Weston's car. Her name was Ms. Kessler. She picked up on the second ring, which surprised me, and I read her 3 of the messages word for word off my phone, my voice flat, my hands not shaking yet. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is textbook exploitation. Let's talk about how you walk away clean." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry either. I remember being surprised by that, lying there at 2 in the morning, waiting for the grief to show up and finding only a kind of cold, organized clarity instead. The same feeling I get when a client's books finally balance after hours of chasing a discrepancy. I am an accountant. I have spent 11 years reconciling other people's numbers, finding the $2 that don't add up, tracing a missing deposit back through 6 months of statements until it surfaces. I did not become good at my job by accident, and I was not about to let the people who'd built an entire economy around my guilt outmaneuver me with a group chat they hadn't bothered to lock. I want to explain how we got here, because none of this happened in a vacuum. None of it happened overnight either. It happened over years, in small increments, the way debt does. You don't notice the balance climbing until the day you finally look. I'm 34. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in a small brick house on Linden Street that my mother still lives in, the same one with the crooked mailbox my father never fixed before he left when I was 9. There were 3 of us kids. I'm the oldest. Weston is 31. Harlow is 28. After my father left, my mother worked 2 jobs, a diner shift in the mornings and a cleaning route in the evenings, and I became, without anyone ever formally deciding it, the 4th adult in the house. I made dinner on the nights she worked doubles. I signed permission slips in a passable imitation of her handwriting when she forgot. I walked Harlow to elementary school for 4 years because my mother's shift started before the buses ran. I still remember the morning he left, a Tuesday in March, because he'd told my mother the night before that he was driving to Cincinnati for a job interview and would be back by Thursday. He took the good suitcase, the hard-sided one nobody else was ever allowed to use, and he never called from the road, not that day or any day after. My mother didn't tell us he wasn't coming back until almost 3 weeks later, when the electric got shut off for the first time and there was no more pretending he'd simply been held up somewhere. I think about that shut-off sometimes now. Whenever I think about all the electric bill calls that came after it over the years, the first one was real. I wonder sometimes if that's the exact origin point for all of it. The moment my mother first learned that need, real or invented, could move me. Nobody called it a burden at the time. It was just what our family did, and I was proud of being the one who could be counted on. That pride is important to understand, because it's the exact thing that got exploited later. I liked being needed. I liked being the responsible one. For a long time, it felt like love, not leverage. The pattern didn't start with money. It started smaller than that. When I was 17, I'd saved $400 from a summer job at a drugstore, planning to buy a used car so I could stop taking the bus to my after-school shift. My mother borrowed it 2 weeks before I found the car for a security deposit on a rental she needed fast. She said, just for a month, she swore on it. I never saw that money again. She never brought it up. Neither did I. day, not for years, because bringing it up felt petty against everything else she'd sacrificed for us. That was the first entry in a ledger I didn't know I was keeping. Weston was different. Where my mother borrowed and forgot, Weston asked and expected. He was the golden child in the particular way middle sons sometimes are, the one who could do no serious wrong because he was so charming about doing wrong at all. He crashed his first car at 19, uninsured, and my mother came to me in tears, not asking exactly, but constructing a scenario where refusing felt like cruelty. I paid for the repairs. 6 months later, I was the one who added him to my auto policy so he could get back on the road at a rate he could almost afford, because his record was already too messy for anyone to insure him cheap. I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. It was 4 years. Harlow's requests always came wrapped in her daughter, Poppy, who's 4 now. Harlow married young, at 22, to a man named Derek who worked construction and then didn't work construction, depending on the season and his mood. When Poppy was born, the asks became constant and specific. Formula: a car seat, half a month's daycare at a place called Little Sprouts on Coliseum Boulevard that cost $1,100 a month. I paid the daycare directly for over a year, transferring it straight to the school instead of through Harlow, because at some point even I had started keeping receipts, even if I hadn't yet admitted to myself why. My mother's pattern had a longer history than the utility bills and blood pressure medication suggest, though I didn't understand that until much later. When I was 20, in my sophomore year at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, she called me during finals week to say the mortgage on Linden Street was 2 months behind, and the bank had sent a warning letter. I withdrew a summer's worth of tips from my job at a restaurant called Marbury's Grill, $1,200, and wired it to her that same afternoon between 2 exams. I found out 3 years later, from my Aunt Robin at a funeral, that the house had never actually been in danger. My mother had refinanced the mortgage 6 months earlier and used the difference to cover a credit card balance she'd never told any of us about. Robin hadn't wanted to be the one to tell me. She said it slipped out during an unrelated argument, and once it was said, she couldn't take it back. Weston's asks got bigger as he got older, the way they tend to. At 26, he wanted to start a food truck business, something built around tacos, a concept he'd workshopped for months with a friend from his old job at a distribution warehouse on Coldwater Road. He asked me for $9,000, framed as an investment, with vague promises of repayment once the truck turned a profit. I said no the first time. I said no the second time. By the third conversation, my mother had gotten involved, telling me Weston finally had direction, finally had a real plan, and didn't I want to be the sister who believed in him instead of the one who doubted him. I gave him $6,000, a compromise I'm still embarrassed by. The truck ran for 4 months before he sold the equipment at a loss, and put what was left toward a security deposit on the apartment I'd later co-sign. I never saw a dollar of that $6,000 again, and nobody in the family ever brought it up, as if it had simply evaporated instead of being spent. For a while, I dated someone who tried to warn me about all of this before I was ready to hear it. His name was Marcus, and we were together for 2 years, from when I was 29 until 31. He used to sit with me while I did bill triage for my family every month, watching me juggle my own rent against my mother's electric bill and Weston's insurance premium, and he'd ask, gently at first and less gently later, when any of them had ever done the same for me. I told him he didn't understand my family. He told me, the night he finally left, that he understood it better than I did, that he'd just been waiting to see if I'd notice on my own before it cost him too much to stay and watch. I was angry with him for over a year. I never told him he was right, though eventually, quietly, alone in my apartment with a legal pad in September, I finally admitted it to myself. None of this means there was no warmth at all, and I think that's part of what made the eventual discovery so disorienting. My mother taught me to drive in the parking lot of a shuttered Kmart on Coldwater Road, patient in a way she rarely was about anything else in her life. Weston used to walk me through video game levels over the phone when I was going through a bad breakup at 26, staying on the line until 2 in the morning some nights just so I wouldn't be alone with my thoughts. Harlow named me Poppy's godmother, cried real tears doing it, and for a long time I believed that gesture meant something uncomplicated. I'm not telling you this to excuse anything. I'm telling you because if the story were only cruelty, it would have been easy to walk away from years earlier. It was never only cruelty. That's what made it take 31 years to fully see, and 11 months to finally end. The specific incident that I think about now, the one that reads like foreshadowing, if I'm honest about it, happened 2 Thanksgivings ago. I'd hosted, because I always hosted, in the 2-bedroom apartment I'd bought myself on Broadway near downtown Fort Wayne, the first real thing I'd ever owned outright. I'd saved for the down payment for 6 years, $22,000, working weekends at a tax prep office every spring on top of my regular job, and closing on that apartment remains one of the only financial milestones in my adult life nobody in my family ever once asked to borrow against. I'd spent $380 on groceries that Thanksgiving and cooked for 9 hours. Near the end of the night, after everyone had eaten, my mother pulled me into the kitchen while I was doing dishes and told me Weston's landlord was threatening eviction over $1,100 in back rent. She didn't ask me directly. She said, "I don't know what we're going to do," and let it sit there in the air between us like a held breath, waiting for me to fill the silence the way I always did. I paid it. I remember standing at my own sink with soap still on my hands, transferring $1,100 from my phone while my family laughed in the next room over a card game, nobody checking to see if I'd even sat down to eat my own dinner yet. I told myself that was just what family did for each other. I didn't clock, not then, that I was the only one ever doing it. What I didn't know, what the tablet would show me 11 months before that final dinner, was that this exact moment, me at the sink, soap on my hands, quietly saving my brother's apartment, had apparently become a story they told each other. A screenshot from that same week surfaced later in the group chat, a photo my mother had taken of me at the sink without my knowledge, captioned, "She doesn't even ask for a thank you anymore. We're so lucky." Lucky. That was the word she used. Not grateful. Lucky, like I was a slot machine that had finally started paying out reliably. That's the relationship I thought I had. A family that struggled, and me, the one steady enough to hold them up. I believed for years that the imbalance was temporary, that eventually things would even out, that my help was building toward something instead of simply being consumed. I found out on a Tuesday in September, standing in my brother's kitchen with a bag of groceries in my hand, exactly how wrong I'd been. The 9 days that followed the discovery moved fast, because urgency demanded it. Weston's auto policy needed unwinding before he could total anything else on my coverage. So on day 2, I called my insurance agent, a woman named Priya, who'd handled my policy for 6 years, and removed him entirely, effective immediately. Priya didn't ask questions. She just said, "Done," and I felt something in my chest loosen half an inch. On day 4, I gave written notice that I'd be off Weston's apartment lease within 60 days. My name had been on it for 2 years, co-signed back when his credit couldn't clear the property management company's screening on its own. I sent the notice by certified mail, kept the receipt, and copied Ms. Kessler on the email confirmation. On day 6, I canceled my mother's pharmacy discount card, the one I'd been quietly funding for 3 years to keep her blood pressure medication under $40 a month instead of the $110 it would otherwise cost. I also canceled the streaming subscriptions I'd been paying for Harlow, the ones she used every night and never once thanked me for. Not in 3 years, not one time. Every cancellation had a confirmation number. Every transfer I pulled had a timestamp. I moved $87,000, most of my savings, into a new account at a bank none of them had ever heard me mention, with no forwarding trail back to anything they could access. I am an accountant. I do not leave loose ends, and I was not about to start now. Not with people who had spent a documented 11 months discussing, in writing, how to keep extracting money from me without my noticing, but the 9 days only handled the immediate bleeding. What came after, what actually took 11 months, was slower and colder, and if I'm honest, more satisfying to build. I didn't confront anyone right away. That was the hardest part, harder than the money, harder than the silence at the sink. I went to Sunday dinners. I smiled. I let them keep asking, and every single time I documented it. Those Sunday dinners became their own kind of research over the months that followed. I started arriving a few minutes early and leaving a few minutes late, giving myself time to notice things I'd spent years training myself not to see. The way my mother's hand would find my forearm right before an ask, a small practice touch meant to soften whatever came next. The way Weston always waited until dessert, when everyone was full and a little sleepy and less likely to push back. I kept a running note on my phone, disguised under a folder labeled recipes, logging dates, amounts requested, amounts I'd actually given in the past, and whatever tactic had been used that particular week. By the following July, I had 11 months of entries, 43 distinct requests, only 6 of which I'd fully declined. The first real test came about 3 weeks after the discovery. My mother called me on a Wednesday night, her voice doing the wobble it always did when she needed something, and told me her electric bill had come in so much higher than usual, and she didn't know how she'd cover it before the shutoff notice. I already knew, because I'd quietly pulled her utility provider's public payment history through a records request Ms. Kessler helped me file, that the bill was $211, the same as every month that winter, not a cent higher. I told her I was tight myself that month. She went quiet, then said, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard her use, "I thought I could count on you." I said I was sorry to hear that, and I meant the second half of the sentence more than the first. Later that night, a screenshot surfaced in the group chat, one I saw because I still had access through an old shared photo backup none of them had thought to disconnect. My mother had written, "She's pulling back. We need a bigger ask, something she can't say no to without looking cruel." Weston had suggested Poppy's name. Harlow had agreed. That was the first ceiling. I thought surely they wouldn't actually use a 4-year-old as leverage. They did, 3 weeks later, when Harlow called in tears. Real tears this time. Or tears real enough that I couldn't be sure, saying Poppy needed a procedure. Something about her ears, tubes, an outpatient thing that insurance would only partially cover. The number she gave me was $640. I asked for the provider's name so I could call and confirm the balance directly, the way I always did now, calm, procedural, an accountant asking for documentation. Harlow got defensive fast, said I was making her feel like a liar over her own daughter's health, said she couldn't believe I'd interrogate her instead of just helping. I told her I'd be happy to pay the provider directly once I had the invoice. She didn't send one. 3 days later, Poppy's ear procedure, if it existed at all, was never mentioned again. The manipulation tactics stacked on top of each other after that, each one reaching for whatever lever hadn't worked yet. My mother started invoking my father, a man none of us had spoken to in 15 years, saying things like, "You're going to end up alone and hard just like him if you keep treating your own family like strangers. That one landed harder than I expected. I sat with it for a full day before I recognized it for what it was: a manufactured fear designed to make my boundaries feel like a moral failing instead of a correction. Weston tried a different angle entirely. He showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning in November, no call first, and stood in my doorway looking, for the first time in years, genuinely rattled. He told me he was behind on rent again, that the 60-day notice I'd sent about the lease had put him in a bind he hadn't planned for, that he understood if I was mad about something, but could we talk about it like adults instead of me punishing him through paperwork. I let him in. I made coffee. I asked him, calmly, what exactly he thought I was punishing him for. He said he didn't know, that I'd been different since September, colder, and did I want to just tell him what was going on? This was, I think, the moment where he came closest to actually apologizing, if he'd had any real information to apologize for. He didn't. He was fishing, trying to find out how much I knew, phrased as vulnerability. I told him I was just being more careful with my money lately, that it happens as you get older. He believed me, or pretended to, and left 40 minutes later, still not knowing. In April, 7 months after the discovery, I found out from Priya, almost by accident, that Weston had been in a minor collision in March, a fender bender in a shopping center parking lot off Maysville Road, and had filed a claim using an old insurance card from his glove box that still listed me as a secondary driver from before I'd removed him the previous September. He'd apparently told the claims adjuster the policy was still active and jointly held, hoping it would speed up the process. Priya flagged it to me directly, since my name still technically appeared in an old underwriting file, and asked whether I wanted to file a formal complaint about the misuse. I told her no. I told her to simply confirm in writing that I'd had no active involvement in that policy since the previous September, and to let the claim untangle itself from there. It took the insurance company 6 weeks to sort out the confusion. 6 weeks during which Weston never once mentioned any of it to me. Not the accident, not the claim, not the mess he'd caused using paperwork that hadn't been current in months. I only knew because Priya told me. He never did. There was a stretch in May where the ask wasn't about money at all, which in hindsight might have been the most effective tactic of the entire 11 months. My mother started calling just to talk, several nights a week, her voice heavy in a specific practiced way, telling me how lonely the house on Linden Street felt now that we'd all moved out, how she sometimes sat at the kitchen table by herself until midnight because sleep wouldn't come. She never once asked me for anything those weeks. She didn't have to. I found myself driving over twice, unprompted, with takeout from a diner she liked on State Boulevard, just to sit with her for an hour, because some old, deep part of me still couldn't stand the idea of her alone and unhappy, and some other part of me, colder by then, understood exactly what I was watching happen, and let myself feel it anyway. Later in the spreadsheet, I found a small note dated that same week. The loneliness thing works better than asking outright, keep doing it before June. I don't think I've ever felt as thoroughly humiliated by anything as I did reading that sentence, months after I'd already fallen for it twice. The last escalation before I found the spreadsheet came in June, and it was the one that came closest to actually working. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, breathless, saying she'd had chest pains the night before and had gone to the emergency room at Parkview Regional, and that between the copay and a follow-up cardiology referral, she was looking at almost $2,000 she didn't have. This was different from the electric bill. This was the kind of ask that short-circuits caution, because if it was real, and I refused, and something happened to her, I'd have to live with that math forever. I told her I was coming to see her, that I wanted to sit with her, bring her dinner, help her sort through it in person. There was a pause on the line, longer than it should have been for a woman recovering from a cardiac scare, and then she said she was actually feeling much better, that I didn't need to come, that she just wanted me to know in case the bill came up later. I went anyway. When I got to Linden Street, she was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, planting bulbs for the fall, moving with no difficulty at all. She told me the doctor said it was likely stress-related, nothing structural, and repeated the $2,000 figure twice more before I left. I called Parkview Regional's billing office myself 2 days later, with her verbal consent, obtained over the phone while she assumed I was simply confirming her insurance on file. The actual balance on the account was $80, a standard emergency room copay, already paid in full at the time of the visit. I didn't say anything about it. I just wrote the date and the real number down in the same legal pad where I'd started keeping everything, next to the electric bill and the ear procedure that never existed, and I let the silence between us do whatever work it was going to do on its own. I want to be honest about something here, because the version of me telling this story now has had 11 months to become someone colder and more precise than the woman who stood in that kitchen with a bag of groceries. In October, about 6 weeks after the discovery, I almost told my mother everything. I sat across from her at her kitchen table on Linden Street, the same table I'd done homework at as a kid, and she looked so genuinely tired, and some old reflex in me wanted to reach across and just ask her why. Wanted an explanation that would make this make sense in a way that didn't require me to rebuild my entire understanding of my family. I didn't ask. I'm still not sure if that was strength or cowardice, probably some of both. The one person outside the family who knew any of this while it was happening was my friend Simone, someone I'd known since our first year at IPFW, back when we were both terrified freshmen freshmen sharing a 200-level accounting course neither of us understood yet. I called her the night I found the spreadsheet, and plenty of nights before that too. She's the one who first told me to write everything down, date it, treat it like a case file instead of a family argument, back in October when I still wasn't sure whether documenting my own mother made me diligent or paranoid. It makes you accurate, she told me once over coffee at a place near her office on Jefferson Boulevard. Those aren't the same thing as cruel. I don't think I could have held the calm, procedural version of myself together for 11 straight months without her checking in on me the way she did, usually with a text that just said, "Still standing?" on the nights she knew a Sunday dinner was coming. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The turning point, the piece that recontextualized everything, came in July, 10 months after the tablet, almost by accident. I'd kept a low-grade habit through the whole ordeal of checking the shared photo backup, the one none of them had thought to disable, mostly out of a grim curiosity about whether they'd slip up and mention me by name where I could see it. Mostly I found nothing useful. Birthday photos, a vacation Weston took to Lake Michigan that he'd told me he couldn't afford this year, 3 weeks after asking me to cover his insurance renewal. But in July, a document appeared in the backup, a PDF that had been photographed page by page and uploaded automatically, the way phones do when you don't think to turn the setting off. It was a spreadsheet, printed out, handwritten notes in the margins in my mother's looping cursive. At the top, in her own writing, it said, "Household support, projected." Below it was a 12-month breakdown. My name was at the top of every column. Next to it, itemized with a precision I hadn't expected from her, was every dollar amount I'd sent in the past 3 years, totaled at the bottom, $61,400. Underneath the total, in smaller handwriting, was a note that took the floor out from under me in a way none of the group chat messages had managed to. It read, "If Weston moves in with me instead of getting his own place, we free up her cosign for something bigger. Ask her about the truck before Christmas." There it was. The plan wasn't just to keep bleeding me slowly. There was an actual document, a projection, treating my income like a household budget line they controlled with a specific escalation already scheduled. Weston hadn't been struggling to find a bigger apartment. He'd been positioning to get me to co-sign a truck loan, something in the $25,000 to $30,000 range based on the notes beside it, under the reasoning that if he moved back in with my mother, my existing co-sign on his lease would be freed up to be redirected somewhere new. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't desperation. It was a plan, drafted and revised, with my name used as collateral I'd never agreed to offer. I kept scrolling through the photographed pages, past the total, past the note about the truck. There were other columns I hadn't absorbed on the first pass. One labeled Harlow Ongoing listed the daycare payments I'd been making directly to Little Sprouts, itemized month by month with a projected note beside December that read, "Ask about increasing to full tuition. Say Derek lost hours." Derek, as far as I knew, still had the same construction job he'd had for 3 years. Another column, smaller, labeled Mom Misk, included a line from June I recognized instantly. ER visit, $80 actual, ask for $2K, difference covers property tax. My mother hadn't just exaggerated the emergency room bill to me on the phone. She'd written down, in her own hand, the exact markup and what she planned to do with the leftover money once I paid it. I sat with that PDF open on my laptop for almost 2 hours that night. I want to say I felt rage. What I actually felt was closer to grief wearing rage's clothing, the particular exhaustion of realizing that a thing you'd believed was love had, at some point you couldn't even pinpoint, become a spreadsheet. I called Ms. Kessler the next morning. I told her about the document. She was quiet, then said something I still think about. "This changes the timeline. You're not dealing with people who lost their way with you. You're dealing with people who built a plan around you." She asked what I wanted to do next. I told her I wanted to be there when they found out I knew, all of them, at the same time, in a way they couldn't spin or soften or split into separate conversations where they could coordinate their stories. I told her I wanted to host dinner. We spent the next month building it properly. Ms. Kessler helped me compile everything into a clean, undeniable record. Every transfer with dates and confirmation numbers, printed screenshots of the group chat messages I'd captured before they could ever be deleted, and a copy of that spreadsheet with my mother's own handwriting circled where she'd written my name at the top of every column like a line item. 3 folders, 3 names. I had them bound at a print shop on Coliseum Boulevard, the same road as Poppy's daycare, an irony I noticed and said nothing about. I rehearsed what I'd say more times than I want to admit, mostly out loud in my car on the drive home from work, sometimes with Simone on speakerphone critiquing my tone the way she used to critique practice presentations back in college. She kept telling me to cut anything that sounded like an accusation and keep everything that sounded like a fact. "Facts don't need you to raise your voice," she told me once. "That's what makes them so much scarier than accusations." I took the advice seriously. Every sentence I planned to say at that table, I built the way I'd build a closing memo for a client. Plain, sourced, impossible to argue with on its own terms. I picked the date carefully, a Sunday in August, our usual dinner night, so nothing about the invitation would raise suspicion. I told them I wanted to do something nice, that it had been a hard year, and I wanted us all together. I meant the second part more than any of them understood understood. I spent the Saturday before cooking. I made the roasted chicken I always made, the one my mother requests every single time and has never once offered to help prepare. I made her lemon pie, the recipe she calls our tradition, a phrase that had started to sound different to me since July. I bought linen napkins, folded them the way I'd seen in a magazine once. Small, useless details that mattered to me for reasons I couldn't fully explain, except that I wanted the table to look like nothing was wrong, right up until everything was. They arrived at 6:30, the way they always did. My mother kissed my cheek at the door and said the apartment smelled incredible. Weston went straight for my fridge and grabbed a beer without asking, the way he always did. Harlow handed me a bottle of grocery store wine, $11, I'd guess, and called me an angel for having them over. I smiled at all three of them, and for the first time in 11 months, the smile didn't cost me anything, because I already knew how the night was going to end. We ate, we talked about nothing, Poppy's preschool, a coworker of Weston's, my mother's garden. I asked questions and listened to the answers and felt oddly calm in a way I hadn't expected. Somewhere around the pie, my mother set down her fork, dabbed at her mouth with one of the linen napkins, and said, "Sweetheart, my electric bill jumped this month. I'm a little short." I watched Weston not even look up from his plate before adding, "That reminds me, my insurance renewal came in early. It's more than I expected." Harlow reached for her wine and said, almost gently, like she was doing me a favor by bringing it up now instead of later, "Daycare charged me twice this month. I was going to mention it after dessert." 3 asks. I counted, out of old habit, 11 seconds between the first and the last, the same rhythm they'd used on me for years, so practiced it barely required eye contact between them anymore. I stood up. I walked to the counter where the 3 envelopes had been sitting since before they arrived, tucked behind the bread box where none of them would think to look. I came back and set one in front of each of them. My mother, then Weston, then Harlow, their names written across the front in the neatest handwriting I could manage. "Open them," I said. Nobody moved at first. Then my mother turned hers over slowly, put on the reading glasses she always insists she doesn't need at the table, and started to read. I watched her face change with every page. Confusion first, the kind you get when you don't yet understand what you're looking at. Then something colder, the particular stillness of someone realizing the ground under them has already shifted before they noticed it moving. Weston opened his next, faster, the way he does everything. His hand went still on the second page, right around where I'd flagged the insurance transfers with my own annotations, a small sticky note that just read, 4 years, never once repaid. Harlow was the last to open hers. She unfolded the pages slowly and smoothed them flat against the table with both hands, the way you'd flatten a map you didn't want to read. Her eyes stopped exactly where I knew they would, on the copy of the spreadsheet, on the line in our mother's own handwriting. If she starts asking questions, cry first. It always works. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The pie sat half-eaten between us, the candles I'd lit for atmosphere still burning like nothing in the room had changed, even though everything had. My mother looked up at me first, her mouth already opening, already reaching for whatever version of the truth had worked on me before. "This isn't what it looks like," she started. "It's a transcript," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "It's exactly what it looks like." Weston set his pages down carefully, like they might detonate if he moved too fast. "Where did you even get this?" he said, and I noticed, even in that moment, that his first instinct wasn't to ask if it was true. It was to ask how I'd found out, which told me everything about what he actually thought I deserved to know. "Your tablet," I said. "You left it unlocked on my counter 11 months ago. I read the whole thing. I've been reading it, one way or another ever since." Harlow hadn't moved. She was still staring at the sentence about crying, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way that, for once, I didn't try to soften for her. "Mom told us that, not me. I never—" She stopped herself, because the spreadsheet under her own hands had her name on transfers too, her daycare threads, her own contributions to the plan even if she hadn't written the crying line herself. "I'm not here to sort out who said what worst," I told them. "I already know. I have known for 11 months. I know about the truck you wanted me to co-sign, Weston. I know you moved my insurance information around to hide a claim from me for 6 weeks last spring. I know, Mom, that you took a photo of me at my own sink 2 Thanksgivings ago and told the group chat we were lucky I don't ask for a thank you anymore. I know Poppy's ear procedure was never real, Harlow, because I called, and there's no such patient on file at that provider." Harlow's face went white. My mother's hands were shaking now, not from cold. My mother recovered first, the way she always did, reaching for the version of herself that had talked her way out of harder rooms than this one. "You're twisting this," she said. "Every family talks about money behind closed doors. You don't know what it's like to raise 3 kids alone, to always be the one worrying. We were venting. People vent. You don't vent with a spreadsheet, Mom," I said. "You don't vent with a truck loan you've already priced out. Venting doesn't have a line item." Weston tried next, leaning forward, his voice pitched into the same careful warmth he used on landlords and loan officers. "Okay, look, maybe this looks bad out of context, but you have to understand, none of us actually thought you'd find out, so it's not like we were, I don't know, actively hurting you. It was just talk. That's the part you think makes it better," I said. "That you only meant it as long as I never knew. That's not an accident. That's the entire design." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him look at my mother, the way he always did when he ran out of his own material, waiting for her to hand him something to say. She didn't. For once, she didn't have anything either. Harlow was crying by then, not loudly, just steady tears tears she wasn't bothering to wipe away. I hated doing it, she said so quietly I almost missed it. Every single time I called you about something, I hated it. I told myself it was different because Poppy actually needed things. I don't have a good excuse for the ear thing. I don't. No, I agreed. You don't. My mother tried once more, her voice sliding into the register she used to use on me as a teenager, half command, half wounded appeal. I am still your mother. Whatever you think of me right now, that doesn't stop being true. You don't get to just erase 34 years over one bad year. I need you to hear this clearly because I'm only going to say it once, I said. I loved being the person you could count on. I am done being the person you could count on for free. Everything I've done in the last 11 months, the insurance, the lease, the pharmacy card, the subscriptions, the $87,000 you'll never have access to, that wasn't me being cold. That was me finally doing the math on a relationship none of you were ever planning to balance. Nobody spoke. My mother's reading glasses had slipped down her nose and she hadn't bothered to push them back up. Outside, a car alarm went off somewhere down the block and cut out again. Ordinary noise from an ordinary night, completely indifferent to what was happening at my table. I remember thinking in that strange, suspended second how odd it was that the rest of the world just kept going. A dog barking, someone's television murmuring faintly through a wall, while three people who'd spent 11 months managing me sat frozen, finally out of moves. The rest of the evening unraveled slowly, the way things do once the version everyone had agreed to believe stops holding. Weston left first, about 20 minutes later, without finishing his pie, saying he needed air, which I understood to mean he needed somewhere he could think without me watching his face. Harlow stayed longer, crying in a way that felt, for the first time in years, less like a performance and more like actual grief. Though whose grief, hers or mine, I honestly couldn't tell anymore. My mother stayed the longest, sitting very still at my table with her hands folded over the folder, like she might be able to fold the contents back into something that hadn't happened yet. I don't know how to fix this, she finally said. I don't think you were trying to fix anything, I told her. I think you were trying to manage me. Those aren't the same thing. She left around 9. I sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, the candles burning down to nothing, the pie gone cold, and I let myself feel, finally, after 11 months of careful, procedural distance, something that wasn't rage. It felt closer to the moment after you finally close a set of books that have been wrong for years. Relief? Yes. But also a strange, quiet mourning for every version of that family I'd spent my whole life trying to believe in. The weeks after the dinner spread out in ways I hadn't fully planned for, even with 11 months of preparation. Word moved through the extended family fast, the way it does. My mother's sister, my Aunt Robin, calling me within 4 days to ask, carefully, what had happened. I told her the truth, plainly, no editorializing, and sent her copies of the same documents. Robin went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said something I didn't expect. Your mother did something similar to me years ago, before you kids were old enough to remember. I should have said something sooner. She became, unexpectedly, one of the people I leaned on most in the months that followed. An ally I hadn't known I had. Proof that the pattern hadn't started with me and likely wouldn't have ended with me either, if I hadn't stopped it. The reaction didn't stay contained to the 4 of us for long. My mother has a large extended family scattered through Allen County, cousins and second cousins who still gather every August for a reunion at Franca Park. And by the following weekend, it was clear she'd started telling her own version of events to whoever would listen, framing me as a daughter who'd ambushed her family over what she called some money and some jokes. My cousin Tessa, Robin's daughter, called me directly instead of taking my mother's word for it, and I sent her the same folder I'd printed for the dinner. Tessa read it overnight and called back the next morning, furious on my behalf in a way that startled me, offering to say something to my mother directly if I wanted her to. I told her that wasn't necessary. I'd already said everything I needed to say at my own table, with the candles still burning. My mother's desperation showed itself most clearly about 5 weeks after the dinner, when she called Miss Kessler's office directly, having found the firm's name somewhere in the documents I'd left her, and tried to argue that the $87,000 I'd moved represented money she was somehow owed for years of raising me. Ms. Kessler, entirely unbothered, explained that there was no legal claim to make, that gifts given freely over the years created no debt and no obligation, and that any further contact of that nature would be handled formally. My mother never tried that particular angle again, but she did start a new group chat 2 weeks later, one I only learned about because Tessa was briefly added and screenshotted it before she could be removed. This one was named Just Family, a title I found almost funny given everything, and in it, my mother had written that I'd cut them all off out of nowhere, and that she didn't understand what she'd done to deserve it. There was no mention of the spreadsheet anywhere in it. There never would be, in any version of the story she told anyone. Weston's version of the fallout was the messiest. Without my cosign, without my name quietly propping up his credit, the lease renewal on his apartment fell through in September, and he moved back in with my mother after all. The exact outcome the spreadsheet had been engineering all along, except now it happened out of consequence instead of manipulation. He called me twice in October, both times late at night, both times some version of the same conversation, an apology that circled the actual apology without ever landing on it, a lot of I know I messed up without ever specifying what the mess had actually been. I let both calls end without agreeing to anything. I wasn't wasn't cruel. I just wasn't available in the way I used to be. On demand, at any hour, for any ask dressed up as an emergency. His car came next. Without my name on the policy, his new insurer ran his record properly for the first time in 4 years and priced him according to what it actually reflected: 2 prior accidents and a lapsed coverage gap. He couldn't make the first payment at the new rate, missed a second, and by November the car was repossessed from the curb outside my mother's house on Linden Street, towed away on a Tuesday morning while she watched from the kitchen window, according to Robin, who heard about it before I did. In a move that told me more about his priorities than almost anything else that year, Weston reached out to our father, a man he'd sworn for 15 years he wanted nothing to do with, hoping for help getting back on the road. I only know this because our father, of all people, called me to ask if I knew what was going on with his son, the first conversation the two of us had had in almost a decade. I told him I didn't have anything to add. I meant it. That part of the story wasn't mine to carry anymore. Harlow's path was different, and honestly the one that surprised me most. About 6 weeks after the dinner, she showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening without Poppy, without Derek, just her, holding a bag from a bakery on Coliseum Boulevard like a small, nervous offering. She didn't ask for anything. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table from the dinner, and told me she'd been the one who suggested using Poppy for the ear procedure lie, that it had been her idea, not our mother's, and that she'd carried that specific fact like a stone in her chest since the night she saw her own handwriting. Adjacent guilt reflected back at her in a folder I'd printed with her name on the front. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She said she understood if I never fully trusted her again, and that she wanted to try to be someone worth trusting eventually, on a longer timeline than either of us could promise right now. It wasn't a full repair. It was something smaller and more honest than that, a first entry in a different kind of ledger. Derek unexpectedly became something like an ally in his own quiet way. He never called me directly. That's not who he is. But Harlow told me later that when she came home from that dinner still shaking, he was the one who sat with her at their own kitchen table and asked her, gently but plainly, how long she'd been lying to her sister about her own daughter's health. She said it was the first time in their marriage he'd taken my side of anything without her prompting him first. I don't know Derek well. I'd never fully trusted the version of him my mother always described. Unreliable, unsteady, not quite good enough for Harlow. But I found out that fall he'd been quietly setting aside money from his paychecks for over a year. Not much, $60 or $70 here and there, trying to build a cushion so Harlow wouldn't have to keep asking me for daycare money. Nobody had ever put that on a spreadsheet. Nobody ever would. Poppy is the one relationship in all of this that never had to be renegotiated, because a 4-year-old had no part in any spreadsheet, no matter how many times her name appeared on one. Harlow and I agreed early on, quietly, without ever needing to spell it out into formal terms, that whatever distance existed between the adults wouldn't extend to her. I still see Poppy every other Saturday, still take her to the park near Franca Park with the yellow slide she likes, still show up with the exact snack she wants without being asked, because I've made a habit my whole life of remembering what people need before they say it. That habit used to scare me a little once I understood everything it had cost me elsewhere. With Poppy, it doesn't scare me at all. She has never once asked me for anything that wasn't hers to ask for. There were financial complications too, the unglamorous kind nobody puts in a dinner table confrontation, but that eat up months regardless. Removing myself from Weston's lease triggered a dispute with the property management company over a security deposit split. 3 weeks of emails with a leasing agent named Mr. Hovarth, who kept insisting I owed a prorated share I'd already paid twice, resolved only after Ms. Kessler sent one very precise letter citing the original lease terms. My mother's pharmacy discount card cancellation caused a real scare in October, when her blood pressure medication briefly jumped to full price before her own insurance caseworker helped her apply for a state assistance program I'd been unknowingly subsidizing her out of needing for 3 years. I felt a flicker of guilt about that one, seeing her finally have to navigate a system on her own, until I remembered the spreadsheet, until I remembered Lucky, until I remembered that my own comfort had never once made it onto anyone's projected budget. In November, Mrs. Kessler helped me draft one final piece of paperwork. Not a lawsuit, nothing dramatic, just a short formal letter to all 3 of them clarifying, in plain language, that I would no longer be co-signing, guaranteeing, or directly funding any future expense on their behalf, and that any future financial request should come through normal channels, if it came at all. It felt almost anticlimactic after everything else. 3 sentences doing the work that 11 months of quiet documentation had built toward. My mother never responded to hers. Weston texted back a single thumbs-up emoji. Harlow was the only one who wrote back anything close to an actual reply. 4 words. Understood. I love you. I didn't respond to that either. Not because I didn't feel anything reading it, but because I'd finally learned I didn't owe anyone an immediate reply just because they'd sent one. Even my job absorbed some of the fallout, in smaller ways I hadn't expected. I work at a mid-sized firm downtown, Halloran and Vance, and my manager, a woman named Denise who'd known me for 6 years, noticed sometime in September that I'd started taking calls in the stairwell and coming back to my desk looking wrung out. I told her, eventually, an abbreviated version, mostly because I needed 2 afternoons off in October for meetings with Ms. Kessler and didn't want to invent a reason. Denise didn't pry. She just said, take what you need, and then, a week later, left a card on my desk that said nothing specific, only that she was glad I had good instincts and better boundaries than she'd had at my age. It was a small thing. It mattered more than it should have, mostly because it came from someone who wanted nothing from me at all. There was a night in late October, almost 2 months after the dinner, when the grief caught up with me fully for the first time. I was at my kitchen table going through old photos for an unrelated reason, and found one from Poppy's first birthday. My mother and Harlow and Weston all crowded around a cake, me behind the camera because I was always the one behind the camera, documenting a family I apparently existed mostly to fund. I cried for almost an hour, not because I regretted anything I'd done, but because somewhere in those 11 months of careful procedural revenge, I'd also had to fully accept that the family I'd been protecting my whole life had, in some real and permanent way, never fully existed the way I believed it had. You can be right to walk away from something and still mourn what you thought it was. Both of those things were true for me at the same time, for a long time. I called Simone that night, the way I had so many nights over the previous 11 months, and instead of talking me through another escalation or another draft of the folder, she just let me cry for a while without trying to fix anything about it. At some point, she said quietly, "You're allowed to grieve people who are still alive." I hadn't thought about it in those terms before, not directly, but it settled something in me to hear it said plainly. I'd spent so long treating the whole situation like a problem to be solved, a discrepancy to be traced and corrected, that I hadn't given myself much room to simply feel what it meant to lose the family I thought I'd had, even while the actual people in it were still just a few miles away on Linden Street, still answering their phones, still, in some limited and complicated way, still mine. By December, 4 months after the dinner, the shape of my life had mostly settled into its new form. I still speak to my mother, briefly, mostly logistics, mostly short, mostly about nothing that matters. I speak to Harlow more than I expected to, cautiously, on a timeline she seems to actually be respecting. One coffee at a time, no daycare invoices anywhere near the conversation. I haven't spoken to Weston much since. We ended up at the same Thanksgiving table in November, technically together, though it barely felt that way. My mother had invited each of us separately, apparently hoping enough time would have passed that we'd simply show up and pretend. Weston and I ended up alone in the kitchen for a few minutes while she fussed over the turkey. "This is weird, right?" he said, just sitting here like nothing happened. I told him it was weird because something had happened, and pretending otherwise wasn't going to make Thanksgiving easier for either of us. He didn't have much to say back to that. We ate at the same table an hour later, 4 feet apart, and didn't speak again for the rest of the night. That's more or less where things still stand between us, both of us performing normalcy for the sake of a table that no longer felt like ours. My Aunt Robin and I have dinner now, once a month, an entirely new tradition built on the wreckage of an old one, and I found that I like her company more than I ever expected to, maybe because nothing between us has a hidden column in a spreadsheet. My mother made one more attempt in January, 5 months after the dinner, showing up at my apartment on a Saturday morning without calling first, holding a small wrapped box she said was an early birthday present, weeks ahead of my actual birthday. A detail I noticed immediately because she had never once, in 34 years, been early about anything. Inside was a bracelet, inexpensive, clearly bought that morning at the mall on Coldwater Road, judging by the receipt still folded in the box. She stood in my doorway and said she just wanted to talk, no agenda, just to see her daughter. I let her in. We sat at the same table. For 20 minutes she talked about nothing. The garden, a neighbor's new fence, careful and pleasant, and then, almost seamlessly, she mentioned that her car had failed inspection and the repair estimate was around $900. And did I know a good mechanic? Not asking for money exactly, just leaving the door open the old way, the way that used to work every single time. I told her I didn't know a mechanic offhand, and that I hoped she got it sorted out. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was recalculating something, and then she gathered her purse and left without finishing her coffee. She hasn't tried that particular approach again. I still cook the roasted chicken sometimes, on Sundays, just for myself now. I still make the lemon pie once in a while too, though I've stopped calling it a tradition, because a tradition implies something is being carried forward together, and mostly now it's just a recipe I happen to like. I think about the 11 months often, not exactly with pride, though there's some of that in there, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition of what it cost me to build something that precise. You don't spend nearly a year quietly documenting your own family without it changing the shape of how you love people afterward. I trust more slowly now. I ask more questions before I say yes to anything. Some people who knew me before would probably call that a loss. I've come to think of it as accuracy. I keep coming back to that one word from the spreadsheet, the word in my mother's own handwriting that started all of this once I finally understood what I was looking at. Lucky. She called herself lucky that I never asked for a thank you. I think about how much simpler this could have felt if she had just thanked me, once, honestly, at any point across all those years. I don't think I was ever asking for much. I think I was asking to matter to my family as something other than a resource, and I never got a real answer to that question until I stopped asking it out loud and started documenting it instead. I don't regret the 11 months. I sharpened exactly what I needed to sharpen, and I used it exactly once, at one dinner, over one cooling pie, and it did everything I built it to do. But I want to be honest about the other things sitting alongside that, because it's real, and it hasn't gone away just because the story has a clean ending. I lost a family that Sunday in August. Even the version of it I now understand had never fully existed the way I believed it did. I still miss the version I thought I had, the one where the sacrifice meant something to someone other than me, where a phone call from my mother didn't require me to check a billing office first. I don't think that grief and the peace I've built since are in conflict with each other. I think they're simply both true, sitting next to each other at the same table, the way most honest endings actually look once the candles finally burn all the way down.